And for those that are interested, this recording will become available on our YouTube channel later this week.
All right, so why don't I go ahead and jump in? Folks are kind of quiet, but feel free to interrupt me at any point and ask questions. I want this to really be more of a discussion than, a lecture. And that kind of reflects a lot of what like eduScrum is about. Moving away from kind of a lecture orientation in teaching and more of an interactive and even team oriented. So if I'd really, set this up right, maybe I would have sent out and broken you guys up into teams and had you done a project during the presentation, but we'll have this be more of just instructional, but definitely looking forward to any questions that anybody has, whether it's about Agile Scrum or the eduScrum. So we could start with just a little bit about my background briefly. So I've been an Agile Scrum consultant for a number of years, kind of started out with Agile kind of organically, working in companies that started using it just on the team level, and then became involved in transformations at multiple companies. And I've used Scrum, everything from insurance companies and scheduling nurses to building a community garden, actually, in the neighborhood. So all kinds of different uses. I'm not a full-time teacher, but I've done a lot of training. So I do have some background there. And I have a rather varied background before getting into technology. Worked in marinas, museums, edited a magazine, and various other things. So, and my interest in education and motivation goes all the way back to, I started out as a preschool Montessori student. So, and, still have fond memories of all the things that I did when I was there. So definitely made an impact working on projects. Just add somebody else to the meeting here. So, and then actually in college, I studied with some of the preeminent people who talk about self-determination and intrinsic motivation. DC and Ryan, they literally wrote the book on motivation. So, and then just this year, I took a training course with the founder of eduScrum. He's based over in the Netherlands, Willie, and I'll probably butcher his name, but Wiens, I think is how he pronounces it. And his information is in the resources, and we'll certainly share the presentation doc that I'll be using. So, and again, if you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to jump right in. Let me go ahead and share screen, share this desktop, and put this into presentation mode. All right, and let me know if you guys actually see my screen at this point. There we go.
We see it.
All right, we can start at the beginning. How's that? There we go. All right, so this is a pretty messy slide, and it's kind of on purpose. My design skills aren't that great, but just the same, it's to kind of convey that there's just a lot going on in education, and even more and more so, right? So, people talk about like STEM, and then they talk about STEAM. So adding the arts into, the science, technology, engineering, and math. And really, I guess, that's where my interest in the eduScrum comes from, trying to bring it all together and make it interactive. So just kind of a question for people on the call. Has anybody heard of eduScrum or used it? Any teachers, just to kind of set expectations or understand who's out there? Shout it out, put it in chat.
Never heard of it.
No? Anybody? Or you all just technology folks?
Not until I met you, Doug.
Okay. All right. I didn't make it up. It's been around for a little while, about 2016. Some people got together and thought about it a lot. And yeah, so let's just jump right in. Why is this? There we go. So agenda, as Dorothy was saying earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about the why, the how, the what, some comparisons to Agile Scrum. And then there are a whole bunch of resources, which I'll make this presentation available because, yeah, there's just a whole bunch of links in there for anybody that's interested. It's always helpful to be able to have those shortcuts. All right. So, whoops. Jumpy. A little bit about the why of eduScrum. So, traditionally, people have lectured to students, people have memorized, it's not very interactive. It's not always very fun. So the goal is to really make it more interesting. And also there's something that's referred to as 21st century skills. Anybody familiar with those? Sometimes referred to as the 4 C's. So critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. So kind of the things that people who work in Agile Scrum do every day. And then the folks who started up eduScrum said that they recently added 2 more C's in there. So caring and choice. And I found that interesting when I went through their training this year that they added those because they kind of relate to the self-determination theory where people talk about what are the factors that really allow people to be more intrinsically motivated than extrinsically. So extrinsically would be, sort of the carrot in front of somebody or a pile of money or, something that's just kind of outside of yourself that's often, feeling almost like a bribe to move forward or a reward. But it's not something that really comes from inside you, whereas intrinsic motivation, sometimes it's surprising what the factors are to some people, what motivates people, because you might think, oh, it's, fame and glory and money. But really, the people who have done the research have found that there are 4 main factors. So a sense of autonomy. So thinking that you have some control, relatedness. So whether that's being on a team or a small group of people trying to create software, or a small group of people in a classroom trying to do a project. And then competence. So, you might think like, oh, I'd be really motivated if it was all easy. But in fact, people are demotivated at that point. And then on the other side of that scale of competence, if something is almost impossible or literally impossible, it's not that interesting to folks. They just get demoralized and kind of quit usually. So there's something that's optimal challenge is a phrase that people will use. And so it's like, it's challenging, but it's not impossible. So it kind of keeps you going. And, a lot of people who design games, and you think of like leveling up, if any of you are gamers, you think about that. What's a game that you stick with? It's kind of addictive. You want to keep playing it because you might be able to win, but it's not so easy that you're bored. And then another factor is feedback. So if you're getting feedback, you're not just, left out in the dark with no kind of connectedness at all, but you are getting kind of regular intervals of feedback. And for the folks who are, familiar with Agile Scrum, that's certainly a part where you want that regular feedback and input. And then if you put all those things together, some other people have used the word flow, and that's kind of a state or a condition where all of that kind of all works together. And if anybody's been fortunate enough to be in that state, it's when, you kind of like don't even pay attention to what time it is. And you're just willing to, keep working on something, even if you weren't being paid sometimes, right? I mean, it's just so much fun. Like you would stay up late, you would stay after work, you'd help somebody else out who you're working with, all of that, you're in the zone, some people might say. So, and then the folks who created eduScrum, they put together like a whole web page about their why, and it touches on a lot of these parts and then goes into more depth. So again, for those who are interested in diving in deeper, you can definitely click that link and read through it. And then a phrase that they use is collaboration that gives you wings. And this whole structure that they build, this framework of eduScrum, is something that they think about, building up these teams and then letting people kind of soar with it. So, any questions on that? Any thoughts? Do you guys feel like you'd rather just memorize stuff and pass the test, or do you think it would be more fun to kind of work with other people and collaborate?
Is that a trick question?
No, people have different ways of working. So,
All right. I'm not a fan of the studying and taking a test, even a little bit.
I've worked with people who just absolutely love to memorize stuff, folks with photographic memories, and they would just love to be in a room by themselves, memorize everything and feel like, they get 100%, they're happy. They were like probably the, homeschooled spelling bee champions, but nothing against those kids. They're great.
Stop making fun of me, Doug. Just stop it. No, everybody knows I'm a magnificent test taker. Honestly, with the group projects, it's like you always ended up doing all the work sometimes if you had any competence at all. So that could be a challenge, but I am interested to see where this is going. You probably hear my kids screaming in the background because I have a special needs child who does ABA training and speech therapy and this therapy. And I can definitely see how this is going with children having a sense of accomplishment, a sense of accountability. I was hoping for that for the teachers because I am totally in the dark as to what's actually going on, but I'm going to let you continue with your presentation.
Yeah, that's fine. Jump in anytime. And, speaking of like learning challenges, people sometimes say like, oh, this is so complicated. This would never work for kids with learning challenges. Or, what ages would it work with? Like, I couldn't do this with like kindergartners. But the reality is that it really does work for any age and any kind of learning capacity. It's just how, the structure of what you're trying to teach is presented and the level of detail of, kind of the framework that you get into. So it can be kind of scaled as appropriate. And that said, even to, using the same framework for like corporate training certainly works. There's a group in the US now who are teaching Agile Scrum, but using this framework. So it's kind of a meta thing, using Scrum to teach Scrum. So if you kind of look at the two sides of this slide, this is sort of the old school, everybody lined up in a desk, you have to raise your hand all the time, the teacher's at the front, they're dictating, information out. And certainly there's a place to convey a certain amount of knowledge, right? I mean, you want a teacher who actually knows the subject, and when questions come up, you still want that to be happening. But allowing students to be creative and collaborative and kind of come up with more of the how they learn is the goal of this framework. So you kind of see on the right side, a bunch of kids working together on projects, closely working, and then, sometimes teachers being involved to give feedback and, just provide the core information I need to move forward. Doorbell is still ringing. Why is that not working? For some reason, I'm not going through slides instead of 1 second. Let me just see if I can jump out of this and then hit that and then jump back in. Sorry about that. All right, well, welcome to, I missed who that was joining late, but welcome, and I will share the presentation, and we are recording this out to the cloud, so we'll put that out later as well for anybody that missed part. So moving right along, again, part of the why. So the origin stories, right? Where did Agile come from? So, and what is it? For anybody, feel free to raise your hand if you have your camera on, if you're not sure what Agile is, or shout it out if you've never heard of it. I know a lot of people confuse like Agile and Agile Scrum. So Agile is kind of the philosophy that came up when a whole bunch of software professionals kind of went off on a ski trip, actually. and got together. They were totally frustrated with the way things had been going in their work, where they'd gotten very strict requirements and just kept moving along in what people described as waterfall, and invariably projects would fail. So they came up with 4 values and 12 principles and wrote all those things down and signed it. And that was in 2001. There's a link out to those for anybody that's interested. That's there. And basically it's saying, things like being flexible is more important than sticking to like an original contract. So just that idea of being agile in the true sense of the word agile, being flexible, but they kind of spelled it out very much from a software development perspective. And then Agile Scrum isn't just the philosophy, but a framework built on top of it. And it literally dictates, that there should be certain specific roles and events and outputs. And an entire guide, text guide, is written on that. I think it's only about 13 pages now. It used to be longer, got revised recently. And then after people had been familiar with Agile, a couple of people said, where else can we use like the Agile philosophy and kind of the Scrum framework? So people have applied it in lots of different places, everything from like sales organizations to, clubs. Like I said before, I worked with a bunch of people. We built a community garden, organized all the work, broke it down, got it done early. So some people were aware of what Agile Scrum was. And so some of them got together and kind of put together sort of a corollary to the Agile Manifesto. And they wrote the Agile in Education Compass. Has 4 points and then a piece in the middle. And you can reach out to it through that link, read all about it. And again, it was kind of framed in that same way as a philosophy where you're weighing something more than something else in a way to kind of orientate, what you think is important in education. So like collaboration being important. And then following that, an entire framework was developed for eduScrum. And there's a guide available that you can read through that as well. It's translated into, I think, 20 or so languages now. And it really spells out what all the different roles are and the expectations. And with anything that's agile, you can certainly follow it by the book. And then you can also try and iterate and see what works for you. So any questions around, when things came about, or has anybody followed Agile Scrum, or I guess nobody really said that they were aware of eduScrum much. You guys are all very quiet.
I followed Agile Scrum. How has been the acceptance of eduScrum in the educational industry?
Yeah, well, it's a challenge, I would say. Historically, there have always been teachers who, hey, let's do a project, right? But it's a little bit more than that. It's pretty structured. My understanding is that it mostly started in Europe. There are a couple groups across the US. And then, it's really around the world now. But the challenge is kind of getting teachers to adopt the framework and still feel like they can, that core curriculum is probably, one of the challenges. To feel like, oh, if kids are doing a project, I'm not in control. I don't know what they're doing every minute. I'm not delivering to them. And so it's kind of overcoming that. And there's some people who've done, research in it, and the results are fantastic. Once people adopt it, both the teachers and the students, are really positive about it because they're all really involved, and the results are generally much better because the students are involved in it. They're not just kind of absorbing or not absorbing, as the case may be, information, but really involved. So I wouldn't say it's widespread, but I would say it's definitely out there, and there are more and more people trying to get trained in it. But I think similar to Scrum, it's a challenge to, if you go into a company to do like a giant transformation versus like, hey, let's pilot a couple teams, see the success, and then kind of let it spread. That's where, I've heard that eduScrum has been more successful. All right, let's jump ahead. There we go. So this is kind of a diagram view of sort of the whole flow, and people are familiar with Agile Scrum might look a little bit familiar, but some of the talk tonight is to get an introduction and kind of do a compare contrast. So you'll see, some different areas, a teacher acting as a product owner, as well as initially often the teacher acts as the Scrum Master as well for a more experienced team. Students or maybe older, they might identify like specific team captains who would be more like a Scrum Master. And then often they use a very specific kind of board because it was started in the Netherlands. They use a term which sometimes they'll say a flip or a flap, which most of us would recognize in the US as sort of like a poster board or a trifold, the kind of thing you bring to your science project and, show off. So as a project gets put together, that's generally where the final project would kind of get put together, as well as all the progress going along. And then depending on the project, there may be like an actual demonstration or output that might be a little bit more formal that would result from all that work. But it's kind of like a Kanban board that's maintained, and it has a little bit more information in it than just simply the tasks, though. So as part of the eduScrum guide, they've added more to it, tried to make it a little friendlier, I'd have to say, more fun. And I'd be interested, when we kind of get through this, if there are any parts of eduScrum that anybody thinks they might take back to try and use in like the Agile Scrum practices that you have now. The other thing that's a little bit different, the way it's been taught to me, is that often this whole cycle, might be relatively short, versus like long-term working on a project where you have many, many sprints. It might be a lot shorter. It might be, everybody reads a book and does a project related to it, or a certain part of history, or a certain, section of a science curriculum. So it's a little bit different than what people in, software development are used to, where you might have many, many cycles to get through it. I don't know if you guys can actually see the details in here. Again, I'll make this available, but anything stand out to anybody as different or strange? All right.
I'm thinking turning a subject into a project.
Yeah. That's definitely kind of where it all sort of starts. So if I was a teacher, I can't really just jump in. I really need to kind of do some preparation. So if my subject maybe was photosynthesis, right? I need to kind of step back before I even present it to the students and think about, what about that subject could I make into some requirements that aren't so controlling, that have some area of creativity left, so that the students can actually build something, do something. But you're taking that subject and trying to make it into a project that the students can get involved in.
So I'm assuming the backlog would be the curriculum for the semester or for the year?
Yeah, it may be just a part of it, or it could be all of it. Really depends on how the teacher, decides if they are comfortable taking everything that they have and putting it into a backlog, or just, if it's one subject or, section of a curriculum. yeah, often not everything kind of fits into it, or they might not have the time to build enough projects. It's new to a lot of teachers, but different than Agile Scrum, where the requirements are coming a little bit differently from customers or product owners. Although I'd be interested who, I guess, or what sometimes people think the customer in this flow actually is. So who's actually determining what the requirements are, and how do students kind of work with that? Any initial thoughts on it's trying to join back. Any initial thoughts on who the customer in a flow like this might be? We could jump back to it. All right, so I mean, this is kind of the big overall view of how eduScrum kind of flows as defined in the eduScrum guide. And at this point, I just wanted to kind of start jumping into some comparisons. You can see on the left, kind of the Agile Scrum, how it's diagrammed often, all the different roles and people who are involved. And then the flow going through a sprint that you've got a clear backlog, but it's constantly getting refined and then flowing through, and increments are getting delivered. And over here, just smaller version of that large cycle, but really starting with all the requirements kind of figured out to start with, and then allowing the students to figure out the how, but it's pretty much figured out at the beginning. And then these are just some kind of sketches that people have done to kind of capture everything that was in a training, that was about eduScrum. And again, without putting everything on a separate slide, a little bit hard to see here, but just capturing, being in an agile mindset, being growth-oriented mindset, and yeah, the 4 C's are captured there. Those 21st century skills that people are trying to actually build out for the real world. As we all know, they're pretty valuable when you're at work, being able to use those versus just memorizing everything. And then this diagram up here is based on, I think, Simon Sinek's starting with why in the center. And so the eduScrum folks kind of capture that. And they felt like, starting with a why is very important, but thinking about the teacher presenting the why. So if it was a chemistry class, like, why is chemistry even important? So that students aren't, just wondering, why is this ever going to be important? So one of the crucial things is to start with that and kind of build some excitement or interest in the subject itself. And then jumping into the what. So what are the requirements going to be? And then allowing the students to kind of take on the responsibility of the how, like, what are they actually going to build in the project? And so there's 3 levels. So I know I talked about like the why, how, and what for this presentation, but that's really from the focus of all about eduScrum, what those are. When the students think about it, they're thinking about it from the subject matter in the project. They're probably not as concerned about the flow of how eduScrum works. They're more interested in the project in front of them, the subject matter. Anybody familiar with kind of the start with why?
I don't know if I'm familiar with the literal start with why, but I do know this is usually about starting with the end in mind, is how I always think of processes like this. So I think usually when kids are thinking of the end, they're thinking of their grade, but this is nice. I really am liking the direction this is going. They're really getting the fruits of the collaboration and getting those little micro victories of what'd you do yesterday, what'd you do today,
Yeah.
what are we going to focus on? I really like this. Please continue.
Kind of that continuous feedback too. Maybe not continuous, but not kind of waiting till the end. I know so many kids, the papers due at the end of the semester, they don't hear anything, they turn it in, and not the best grade, maybe. But if you get that continuous feedback, and certainly some teachers do, hand in an outline, get some feedback, hand in a draft, get some feedback. So along those lines, this is just more project oriented.
Absolutely. Yeah. I know a lot of parents right now have this absurd level of visibility to their kids' grades, like every single paper they can see, because actions have consequences and they're trying to get that through. But I like this as a more collaborative little micro win way. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're getting that feedback and you're able to kind of iterate and change before it's like, the end. And then another thing just in this drawing, and so there are all these kind of extra elements that eduScrum is identified. So they have like a wall of failure and a wall of pride. And so that's kind of pointing out like not everything's perfect, but let's celebrate, the successes. And the definition of fun. So the teams actually identify what would actually be fun to do during their project, not just do the project, but what do people on your team actually identify as fun? All right, and then just some other kind of visualizations of Agile Scrum here on the left and eduScrum on the right. Again, identifying what the roles would be, and then the planning, stand-ups, reviews, and a retrospective. And again, keep thinking about who that customer would actually be in an education environment, because it is different. Yeah, and this drawing on the left, I kind of liked because a lot of times in Agile Scrum, it's, people take it very, very literally and kind of leave out the idea that, oh, there might be a business analyst involved or a designer. So, to actually get the work done, you need all of those skills. And this is a breakdown actually from the people who did the training that I took earlier this year, and they went through and in kind of a lot of detail. There are multiple pages of this. I'll go relatively quickly because it's a little dense to be looking at all this text. But the idea is that they broke down by elements, a working product. So, and I'll just kind of go through this one to start. For Agile Scrum, it's the maximum value for the customer, right? So that's the output. In eduScrum, it's really more, it's a little cliche, but it's more about the journey than the destination. Certainly you want to learn something, but what you learn along the way is kind of the working product that is delivered from the perspective of the people that teach eduScrum. And it sounds like a lot of the students too, from what I've heard from them. So the knowledge and skills that the students actually gain, and certainly, that knowledge and the actual competencies of learning a body of knowledge is great, but the way that they learn to work with each other is also crucial. And then just teams, I'd say, just pointing out quickly, one of the things that is pretty different when the teams are set up in eduScrum, one of the best practices they use, they have a skills sheet, the kids fill it out, they anonymize it, and then they look for different skills and they set up completely cross-functional teams. Might be an interesting thing for people to try, in Agile Scrum in a working environment. How many people are great at sketching? How many people are great at doing research? How many people, and sometimes we don't even know what people's skills are until, you ask them. I know Julie was asking if anybody has any expertise in Flutter as a developer. So, it's the kind of thing until you start asking, sometimes you don't even know if you have that within your own company, especially in very large companies. A lot of those skills are kind of hidden. People have a job description, you don't know what they're good at. And you also don't know what they don't feel that they're comfortable doing. And so with eduScrum, one of the other things is to think about what people want to develop. So when they get this list of skills, they check off what they're good at. And then there's another column of what you'd like to be better at, which I found was pretty interesting because sometimes people feel like they're really just stuck in a role, right? but it's all about growth. Product backlogs, we kind of mentioned that before. This is coming from the customer, and here it's like the educational goals, the course that people want to cover. And then specific roles, as I mentioned before, product owner and Scrum Master, maybe the teacher kind of combined to start, and then a more mature team might take on that role of having a Scrum Master within the team. And here they actually defined customer as being the state, kind of a European way of thinking about it, I think. So this was all probably written in Dutch and then translated to English. I did some editing, but I left a couple things. So the state and the parents are the customers. So in essence, when kids go to school, college, who's benefiting from that? The customer is, kind of the larger environment and people's parents, kids' parents. And then if you were somebody working for a company and was sent off to training, it would be the organization that you work for. And then they actually, the folks who did this analysis thought about like students actually becoming customers as well. So as you become very intrinsically motivated in the work that you're doing to finish a project, you're actually thinking about how could I be an even better student? What are my goals as a student? And so maybe you're creating some of your own, kind of targets out there. And so you become the customer yourself. Again, kind of meta, but goes a long way to have a student who's trying to learn more versus being forced to memorize something. And here, just kind of breaking down sprints and iterations and how they're a little bit different. Again, I talked about maybe a short sprint cycle for education sometimes. Definition of ready, definition of done are the two common kind of agreements that teams come up with. But over on the other side in eduScrum, they have like a definition of fun and definition of doing and definition of communication. So really kind of documenting all those different ways of working and building up that trust between people on the team. So possibly something that could be used, outside of education. Backlog items, just talking about estimating and how eduScrum is a bit different. Often you're starting with stories already known and then kind of moving them out. And the events, so planning and daily stand-ups, sprint review. Over on the eduScrum side, they do kind of talk about making the retrospective a little bit more unique. And so it's a personal reflection as well as a team reflection. And so it's really about improving in a lot of different ways. And they formalize, I was mentioning about setting up the teams, recruiting based on competencies and skills. All right. So we're kind of jumping into some of the resources now. I found some decent links to some videos out there where you can kind of see, kids' reactions to having been involved in using this, as well as some teachers who went through the training. Of course, I'm sure they picked the positive ones, but it seemed overwhelmingly positive. So it was great to see. And then there's literally an hour long. So some of these are just a few minutes, 8 minutes of some students in the Netherlands and a minute of some teachers. But then there's an hour-long training with Willie and Jeff Sutherland, who's kind of the father of Agile Scrum, where they really kind of break it down and do some comparisons, as I've been talking about, between Agile Scrum and the eduScrum. So definitely worth watching those if you have any interest or sharing them with other people. And the video of the students has subtitles, but it's pretty clear what's going on. It's great. And, I've heard some quotes from students who have been using this, and, some of the reactions have been things like, I don't know why every class isn't taught this way. These are some of the FAQs, kind of trying to counter, some of the arguments that teachers might have, or parents or administrators. What level is it effective? Is it hard to evaluate kids because they're lost in a team and you can't really see what's going on? I kind of like that answer. Can one distinguish within a team? And again, it's a little awkward having been translated, but sure. And if you don't, the students will. So basically saying, like, even if a teacher isn't identifying who the slacker is, or who the star is, other people on the team will point it out. So just interesting perspective. And if you do have other questions, the folks who do the training over in the Netherlands are pretty free with putting their email address everywhere, LinkedIn, on all their documentation. So I put it in the presentation as well, if you do have any questions that you feel they might be able to answer. Yeah, one question that often comes up: are there any subjects that this wouldn't be good for? And their feeling is no, there aren't any. So it's generally the answer is like, it's good for everything. And then just jumping into tools, I kind of did a wide collection, some from the training that I went through earlier this year, some of the tools that were used there. There's literally in Miro, one of the best things is this eduScrum template. It's like totally built out with descriptions in it. If people aren't familiar with Miro, it's kind of like an electronic whiteboard, but you can leave templates out there. So this one here, this black border, if you click this link, it'll go out to the Miro template. You just say, I want to use it, and then you can do everything you need to and set up a specific board to use for a class. It's pretty great. So somebody put a lot of time into building that out. It's great. And then just, as people in education, there are a lot of free utilities here that people could use. Any other free tools anybody's been using recently that you want to share?
For design tools, is Flow free? I think it is. We use that a lot.
Oh,
You can do some creative stuff with that.
All right. Sounds good. So like mockflow.com. All right, I'll just throw it in the chat, Mockflow. Yeah, always great to, whatever tools, and again, depending on the project, but in the training that I went through, it was surprising, so we did our own projects, even though we were learning how to use it. They were kind of doing projects, and the end results were significantly different. I would have to say my team was kind of like sort of black and white and very concrete, and another team, it looked more like, this beautiful poster with trees and, just fantastic. And, this whole long presentation, I think somebody worked a lot outside of the training, but hey, it looked beautiful. So it's just interesting, I think we all learned similarly, but their output was fantastic. So yeah, these are all active links. Welcome to jump into those. And then websites, I collected a fair amount of websites, directly out to the training site. There's a conference going on this year in Greece. Sounds great to me. I don't know. 4th of July. There's another group in the USA who's doing a lot at the kind of university level with research into Agile in education. So Hannah Siddiqui is kind of behind a lot of that. So there are links out to that. There's some upcoming training in the spring. And then just links out to like the 21st century skills. If you're not familiar with those, there's a good video, and then a more comprehensive guide. So if somebody couldn't leave it at 4 C's or even adding 2 more, I think there were like, I don't know, 17 things they listed as skills. Once somebody has an idea, you just go with it. So, and then a reading list. These are all books that I found useful from Agile Scrum, as well as also kind of related to eduScrum. Yeah, more people dropping off, but yeah, we'll put a link out to where the recording is. So everything from the origins of Scrum itself to this book about motivation drive, which is based on DC and Ryan's research, but made a little bit easier to read by Daniel Pink, so popular author. And psychological safety is really important in Agile Scrum that we all use, but also in education, especially. You know, if you have a bunch of kids, there's all kinds of dynamics going on there. So trying to get over that and be able to get a group of kids to work together is certainly a challenge, as well as with adults. It's a challenge. Grit is a great book. Tribe, it's about how people kind of historically have been more likely to work together. Speed of trust, definitely in eduScrum, building that trust between a teacher and students and amongst the team, how to build that trust. And then just self-determination theory. Ooh, and a typo. Nobody's perfect. See, building up that psychological safety right there. It's not on purpose, but I'll fix that before I post it. And this was a poster that Willie, the instructor, had used in the past, and basically sort of a, you know, philosophical approach that, you know, students need teachers, but then at a certain point, you know, the student is kind of finding their own way in education. And then definitely keep in touch. Interested if anybody's going forward with trying to use this, whether literally in education or, you know, open environment. Is anybody on the call in the like school or university level? Any questions? Things come up? Curious? Sure, there are things that I haven't mentioned.
The only thing I can think of that might be a slight criticism of this is I can think of students, especially particularly young ones, since they're saying this can be done in kindergarten and whatever, where a lot of times students can be pigeonholed into, well, I'm the artist, I'm good at English, that means I'm not good at math. So where they're kind of like saying, okay, by skill set, let's form the teams. I would worry that students would kind of grasp onto an identity that isn't their whole self yet, because you're still developing. But that's the only thing that I can come up with a criticism of this. Otherwise, I love it. I think it's fabulous.
I think that carries on to adults as well. I'm not good at coding. I'm just going to help people organize. Yeah. So yeah, that can definitely be a challenge. It was interesting in the sheet, there were, you know, there was sort of like a skill, and then there were 3 columns. And so one of the columns was intended for, you know, what you really did, you thought you were good at now. And then another column was what you'd like to get better at. So it gave people at least the opportunity. And, you know, certainly some people felt like, I'm sure I'll never be good at coding or math or literally for doing artwork, as you can tell by my clip art. So yeah, it's interesting, and part of the retrospective that they do with the students is reevaluating those skills and thinking like, was there a progress in the skills that they had? Like, did they learn something from a peer, you know, during the project? So, you know, they're trying to get beyond that, obviously, and not perfect, but I think just identifying the skills, I think some of the risk when people started doing some of these projects or had done them without this framework was, you know, it's sort of like picking kids for the kickball team or the softball team, right? It's like, oh, okay, I want all the fast runners. Okay, what we're going to do is have everybody say if you're a fast runner, and then we're going to put 1 each on every team, right? And so it kind of balances it a bit. And maybe somebody will become faster. I don't know.
Cool.
All right. Let's see. Any questions? I wasn't looking at all the chat. I think just a lot of people were coming and going. Local school board or parents. Maybe that was an answer to who the customer. Collaboration.
It was.
Okay.
All right, well, before we lose everyone else, just a quick announcement, I guess, for next month. I just put the link in the chat. We have our very own Dorothy presenting on the impact of leadership effectiveness. What you'll gain is an understanding of the relationship between leadership effectiveness and business results, possible ways to achieve your leadership effectiveness, and how to build a business development plan to increase your leadership effectiveness. And last but not least, amongst many other things, ways to scale those leadership skills to your teammates. Apologies, I'm not on camera, but hopefully you guys got that, my bandwidth.
Excellent.
I want to thank you, Doug, for a great presentation. We will be sure to get this up on our YouTube channel, and we can email you all if you read through the meetup site, just to let you know where it's posted when it's ready.